A newborn baby is dying. Her cries have faded to whispers, the sound of giving up. Her father sits alone in a cabin buried under 4 feet of snow. His wife died 2 weeks ago. He has no milk, no help, no hope. He's tried everything, sugar water, meat broth. Nothing works. His daughter is slipping away, and there's not a single thing he can do to save her. 12 miles to town, 6 miles to the nearest neighbor. Both might as well be 1,000 in this blizzard. Then, a knock at the door. Impossible. No one could survive out there. But when he opens it, he finds a woman, half frozen, barely alive, carrying one thing that will change everything. What happens next will show you that sometimes, when you've lost all hope, help arrives in ways you never imagined. What you'll gain from this story: a powerful reminder that love can bloom from loss, that family isn't just blood, it's choice, and that the darkest storms often bring the greatest blessings. If stories like this touch your heart, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever received help when you needed it most? Share this with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. Now, let's begin. This little cabin was a place Ethan had built himself 3 years ago, a place meant for promises and a new family. But tonight, it just felt like a cold tomb. He sat by the dying fire, holding Clara. She felt so fragile. He had forgotten how a newborn could just break your heart with their cries. She was hungry, and had been for days. The snow had been falling for 4 days straight, burying them completely. The drifts were as high as a man's chest. His closest neighbor was 6 miles away down a road that had vanished. The town of Bentwood, his only real hope for help, was 12 miles in the other direction. He had tried everything he could think of. He gave her warm sugar water, drop by drop from a clean cloth. He even boiled some dried deer meat into a thin broth for her. She just choked, her little face turning a painful shade of red. His wife, Catherine, would have known exactly what to do. That thought hit him hard every time, knocking the wind right out of him. 2 weeks ago, she was right here, laughing and holding their baby. Then a fever took her in just 3 days. He had buried her himself on a small hill under her favorite cottonwood tree. He carved her name on a wooden cross, while his newborn daughter screamed inside the cabin, alone with a father who was failing her. Now, in the dark, with the wind howling, Ethan felt a cold despair he had never known in all his 32 years. He felt completely and utterly beaten. "I'm so sorry, little girl," he whispered to her. "I just don't know what else to do." Clara's cries had turned into faint, sad whimpers. That silence scared him more than any scream. It was the sound of giving up. He got up and started pacing the small room, trying to use his own body heat to keep her warm. His own stomach was aching with hunger, but he saved what little food they had left, just in case. There was some cornmeal, a little coffee, and a few strips of dried meat. Nothing for a baby. The wind slammed against the cabin, making the walls groan. He knew he had to go outside for more firewood soon, which meant leaving Clara all alone in the growing cold. He hated it. He hated that Catherine was gone, and that he was letting their daughter down. This man had survived just about everything this land could throw at him. He had fought off rustlers, wolves, and even crawled for 2 days with a broken leg. But none of it prepared him for this, for holding his own child as she faded away, with no way on God's earth to save her. "Please," he begged the empty dark room. "Please, don't take her from me too." And then, through the roar of the blizzard, he heard a sound that did not seem possible. A knock. Someone was knocking on his door. Ethan's head shot up. He had to be imagining things. Nobody could be out in this kind of storm. It was suicide to travel in this weather. The knock came again, harder this time, impossible to ignore. He crossed the room in a few long steps and tore the door open. A person stood there, covered in snow, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak. The wind whipped at them, and for a second that is all he saw, just a shape against the white. Then the person looked up, and he saw a woman's face. She was young, maybe 25 years old. Her face was red with cold, and her lips were almost blue, but her eyes were sharp and incredibly green. "I need shelter," she said. Her voice was steady, even though she was shivering. She sounded like she was from back east. "Please." Ethan just stepped aside and let her in, then quickly bolted the door behind her. The sudden quiet was deafening. The woman stood in the middle of his floor, dripping melted snow everywhere. She carried a bag over her shoulder and held a small basket in her hand. Her city boots were soaked and falling apart. "There's a fire," Ethan managed to say, pointing to the hearth. "You should get warm." But she was not looking at the fire. Her eyes were fixed on the baby bundled up in his arms. "Is the child sick?" she asked. "Hungry," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "Her mother died 2 weeks ago. I don't have any—" He could not bring himself to finish the sentence. The woman's face changed in an instant. She became all business. She set her things down, took off her wet cloak, and walked right up to him. "May I?" she asked, holding her arms out for the baby. Ethan did not hesitate. He gently passed Clara to her. The woman held the baby like she had done it 1,000 times before, with a calm confidence that stunned him. She studied Clara's face, then looked around the cabin, taking in the dying fire and the nearly bare shelves. "How long since she last ate?" the woman asked. "Hours," Ethan replied. "I tried sugar water." "No," the woman said softly. "That would not be enough." She looked down at Clara. "She is weak, but she is a fighter." The woman carried Clara to the table, then opened her basket. Inside, she had a cloth bundle and a jar. "I have goat's milk," she said, unwrapping a clean glass bottle. "It will keep her alive." Ethan just stared at her, unable to speak. "How?" "I was staying at a farm about 5 miles from here," she explained. "Their goat had babies, so they had extra milk. I was trying to get to town when the storm hit." She did not waste another second. She warmed a little milk and soaked a clean rag in it, then brought it to Clara's lips. The baby's eyes flickered open. She made a tiny sound, and then her instincts took over. She began to drink. A slow smile spread across the woman's face. "There we go, sweetheart," she whispered. Ethan felt a wave of relief so powerful it made his knees weak. He dropped into his chair, just watching. The woman fed Clara with a patient, steady hand. Slowly, the color returned to the baby's cheeks. "She will need to eat every 2 hours for the first day," the woman said without looking up. "After that, we can stretch it out." "We?" Ethan repeated the word. She finally looked up at him, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I am not going anywhere in this storm, and you clearly need some help." It was not a question or an offer. It was a fact. All Ethan could do was nod. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me yet. We have a lot to do," she replied, glancing around. "First, that fire needs more wood. Then we need to boil some water. And do you have clean cloths for diapers?" "Some," he said, his voice catching. "Catherine made them." The woman's expression softened. "Catherine was your wife?" "Yes." "I am very sorry for your loss," she said, and her simple, kind words meant more to him than she could ever know. Ethan was a man hanging on by a thread, and the last thing he needed was pity. What this stranger offered was something real, a steady look that saw his pain without drowning him in sympathy. He just gave a small nod, too choked up to speak. She introduced herself plain and simple. "My name is Margaret Hale." He managed to get his own name out. "Ethan Cole." "Well, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice calm as a quiet river, "our first job is to see your little girl through the night. The rest of it can wait." In the next hour, Margaret turned that cold cabin into a sanctuary. She moved with a purpose that surprised Ethan, getting the fire roaring and boiling water to fix a proper place to feed the baby. When she found Catherine's trunk and pulled out the tiny clothes his wife had made, Ethan had to look away. Little Clara ate 3 times, each feeding a little stronger than the last. Soon, darkness fell, and for the first time in days, the baby was sleeping soundly in her cradle, warm and full. Ethan just stood there, watching her breathe, not quite believing she was safe. You need some food, Margaret's voice came from behind him. He turned to see her, cloak drying by the fire, looking bone-tired but steady. You do too, he said. She just nodded. I will fix something. You sit before you fall. He had not noticed how shaky he was until he collapsed into a chair, every part of him aching. She found his cornmeal and coffee, then pulled bacon and bread from her own pack. Before long, the smell of frying bacon and Johnny cakes filled the cabin, and Ethan's stomach clenched with a hunger he had forgotten he had. They ate without a word. He had to make himself eat slowly. When they were done, she held a coffee cup and looked into the flames. How long have you been out here alone? She asked softly. 12 days, since my wife passed. He explained that family was states away, and with the storm, help was weeks off at best. I did not know what else to do, he admitted, his voice tight. Tonight, I thought I was losing her. Margaret met his gaze, her eyes clear. But you did not. You kept her alive. Barely, he whispered. Barely is all it takes sometimes, she said. You did what you had to do. That is what matters. He had no answer for that. For a while, the only sounds were the howling wind, the crackling fire, and the baby's soft breathing. Just having someone else there felt like a prayer answered. He finally asked how she had found him. She explained she had been teaching at the Miller farm and got lost in the blizzard trying to get back to town. I could not see 5 feet ahead, she said. I was wandering for hours. Then I saw your light. She looked right at him. You left a lantern burning in the window. For Catherine, he said before he could think. It was foolish, I know. I thought maybe she could find her way. His voice broke. It was not foolish, Margaret said gently. It saved my life. Maybe she did come home, just not in the way you figured. The idea did not hurt like he thought it would. It felt like a strange kind of peace. You should take the bed, he said, needing to change the topic. I can sleep by the fire. You are hurt, she replied, glancing at his leg. You have been favoring it since I got here. He had forgotten all about twisting his ankle 3 days earlier. With everything else, the pain just got lost. It is nothing, he insisted. That is why you are taking the bed, she said, leaving no room for argument. I will handle Clara's feedings every 2 hours. You are no good to her if you cannot stand Mr. Cole. He wanted to argue, but the thought of a real sleep was too much to resist. All right, he finally agreed. Lying in the dark, the bed still smelled of Catherine, of her lavender soap. He had not touched the sheets since she had passed. The grief hit him hard, but underneath it this time was something new. It felt a little like hope. Clara was in the next room, alive and well. His daughter was going to see tomorrow. A stranger walking out of a blizzard had made sure of it. He was not a man who believed in fate or miracles, but he believed in what happened tonight. He believed that sometimes, when you have nothing left, help just shows up. Through the door, he heard Margaret start to hum a soft tune. For the first time in 2 weeks, Ethan slept. He woke to the sound of his daughter crying. But this time it was not a weak, pitiful sound. It was a strong, demanding cry that filled his heart. The storm had softened. He limped into the main room and saw Margaret in the rocking chair feeding Clara. She looked up at him with a weary smile. Morning, she said. Your little girl sure has a healthy set of lungs. He rubbed a hand through his hair, still half asleep. How long you been up? Never did get to sleep, really. Clara woke at midnight, 2 and 4. She's doing fine, though, Margaret said, shifting the baby. You, on the other hand, look like you got some real rest. He'd slept a solid 8 hours. He felt a pang of guilt. I should have been up helping you. You should have been sleeping, and you were. Don't you start an argument with me, Mr. Cole. I was a school teacher. I'm used to winning. A small smile touched his lips. I believe it. After Clara burped, Margaret laid her back in the cradle. Storm's breaking, she said, nodding toward the window. Ought to be clear enough to travel tomorrow. A cold knot formed in Ethan's gut. She would leave. She had her own life. Right, he said quietly. You've done more than enough. Ethan spent the day on chores that couldn't wait. He dug out the wood pile from under the snow and checked on his horse and milk cow in the barn. The cow was still giving a little milk, thank the good Lord. It wasn't much, but it would help. By nightfall, things felt almost normal. The little cabin was warm and tidy, and Clara's cries sounded strong and healthy. Margaret had brought a sense of order back to his world. Over a dinner of venison stew, Ethan found himself watching her. She'd rolled up her sleeves, and dark curls were escaping from her pins. He realized she was pretty, in a quiet, sturdy kind of way. Then guilt washed over him. Catherine had only been gone 2 weeks. He had no right to be noticing another woman. Tell me about Catherine, Margaret said, her voice soft. Ethan looked up, startled. Your wife, she clarified gently. You loved her something fierce, that's plain to see. I'd like to know a little about her. No one had asked him that. Folks offered their sympathies, then quickly changed the subject. She was from Ohio, he started, his voice a bit rough. I met her at a town dance. She told me I was the worst dancer she'd ever laid eyes on. A faint smile returned. Was she right? Margaret asked. Lord, yes. Got 2 left feet. He paused. She would have liked you. Believed in education, just like you do. She'd have known just what to do with the baby. She had so many plans. But nobody plans on dying, Margaret said quietly. And she left behind a man who's doing the best he can in a terrible spot. That's not failure, Mr. Cole. That's love. Ethan had to look down at his hands for a moment. What about you? He finally asked. How'd a school teacher from back east wind up out here in Wyoming? Adventure, I reckon. And stubbornness, she said with a small smile. My father wanted me to marry a banker in Boston. A safe, predictable life. I wanted to do something that mattered. Your family must have been thrilled, he said. My mother cried for a week straight. They're still waiting for me to come to my senses and head back home. Will you? No, she said, sure as the sunrise. I like it here. People are who they are. There's no room for pretending when you're just trying to get by. He nodded. That's the truth of it. Still, I could do without these blizzards. He stood up. Either way, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Ethan, please. Then you ought to call me Margaret. Stood up too, gathering the plates. You need to get off that ankle before it gets any worse. I will take care of Clara's next feeding. He wanted to push back, but the throbbing in his ankle and the bone-deep weariness were setting in hard. You need your sleep as well, he said. I rest when the baby rests. We have a good system going, so do not mess it up with some misplaced idea of duty. She was right, and he knew it. Still, letting her help felt like he was failing at the most important job he had. Margaret's voice softened. Ethan, let someone help you. There is absolutely no shame in it. He looked at her, this stranger the storm had brought, the woman who saved his daughter. She had brought order and warmth back into his shattered world, and she was looking at him with understanding, not pity. All right, he finally said. Thank you for all of it. A smile touched her lips. You are welcome. Now go lie down before I have to make you. That night, with Margaret rocking Clara in the other room, Ethan stared at the ceiling. For the first time since Catherine died, he felt a wave of gratitude. It was not just for the help, but for the simple fact that he was not completely alone anymore. But the next morning did not arrive as he had hoped. He awoke to the storm roaring back with a terrible fury. The wind screamed against the cabin walls, and the snow was a solid white curtain, hiding the barn just 30 feet away. A bitter cold had settled in overnight, painting frost on the inside of the windows. Margaret was already up, feeding Clara by the soft glow of a lamp. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she moved slower than before. He realized with a pang of guilt that she had been up all night again. The storm came back, she said, her eyes on the baby. It is worse this time. Ethan went to the window, staring out at the blizzard. This could last another day, maybe two. "I suppose that means I am staying," she said it simply, but he could see the tension in her posture. "The school will be fine. Mrs. Patterson can handle my classes." "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you have to get back. What I need does not matter when trying to travel would be foolish." She shifted Clara to her other arm. "Besides, your daughter needs to eat on schedule. I am not leaving until I am sure you can manage by yourself." Her words should have felt like a judgment on his fathering. Instead, a wave of pure relief washed over him. He had one more day, maybe two, to learn what she already knew by heart. "I will make us some breakfast," he offered. They slipped back into the easy rhythm they had found, moving around the small space without getting in each other's way. He made coffee and pancakes while she tended to the baby. But by noon, something was off. Margaret was quiet, and her movements seemed too careful. When she stood up after putting Clara in her cradle, she swayed and had to grab the table to steady herself. Ethan was by her side in an instant. "What is wrong?" "Nothing. I just got up too fast." But her face was pale, and he felt a tremble in her arm. "You are completely worn out. When did you last get any real sleep?" "I have been resting between her feedings. Resting is not the same as sleeping." He firmly guided her toward the bed. "You have been going for nearly 2 days straight. Clara needs you to not collapse." My voice was gentle but firm. "I can handle the next couple of feedings. You showed me what to do. Now lie down before you fall down." She started to argue, then seemed to reconsider. She sat on the bed, and the look of relief on her face confirmed how close to her limit she truly was. "Just for an hour," she murmured. "Wake me in an hour. I will wake you when you have had some real rest." Her eyes were already closing, and within moments, she was sound asleep. Ethan watched her for a second before quietly shutting the door. He returned to the main room where Clara was starting to fuss. "All right, little one," he whispered, lifting her from the cradle. "Let us see if your papa can do this on his own." And he could. Margaret had shown him everything, from warming the milk just right to holding Clara so she would not choke. It took him longer, but the baby ate and went right back to sleep. The small success felt like a huge victory. He spent the afternoon doing quiet chores, fixing a drafty spot in the wall and organizing their low supply of food. It was mindless work that let his thoughts wander. Margaret had been there for 3 days, and the cabin already felt warmer, more like a home. There was an order to things now. The dishes were clean, the floor was swept, and Catherine's sewing basket was out with a half-mended shirt next to it. She was making the space livable again almost without effort. She was not replacing Catherine, no one ever could. But she was building something new from the wreckage, something that felt a little like hope. And that scared him because he knew the storm would end. Margaret would leave and go back to her own life. He would be alone again with Clara, facing the long winter. Clara woke for a feeding at 4 o'clock and again at 6. Margaret slept right through both, so deeply that he checked on her twice, just to be sure. When she finally came out of the bedroom around 8 that evening, she looked confused and rumpled from sleep. Ethan was at the stove, and Clara was sleeping soundly in her cradle. Everything was calm. "You let me sleep the whole day," she said, stopping in the doorway. "You needed it." "Clara and I did just fine." He served her a bowl of beans. "Eat. You must be starving." She took the bowl, still looking a bit dazed. "I did not mean to be out for so long. Your body obviously had other plans." He motioned to the table. "Sit down and eat. You have done so much to keep this place running. I am not about to let you collapse now." They ate in a comfortable quiet for a few minutes. The color was returning to her cheeks, and the exhaustion was fading from her eyes. "Thank you," she said at last, "for making me rest. I did not realize how tired I was. You have been running on empty since you arrived. I should have made you sleep sooner." "I am not good at taking help," he admitted. "My mother would say that is a failing of mine," she said with a small smile. "It seems we share that." "Yes, I have noticed." She finished her food and went to check on Clara. "You did a good job with her today. She seems happy. She is a good baby. That makes it easier." He looked over at his daughter, a fierce, protective feeling rising in him. She looks so much like Catherine. It hurts sometimes. Seeing her mother in her is a gift, Margaret said. Is it? Or is it just another way to miss what I have lost? Margaret thought for a moment. Maybe it is both. Grief and love are not two different things, Ethan. They are just two sides of the same coin. The pain you feel is just proof of how much you loved. He had never thought of it that way. The simple truth of her words settled over him, not lessening the grief, but making it feel less like a battle. You are wise for your age, he told her. I am 26, not a child, she laughed. You just see things for what they are. That is just good country sense. We were raised to be practical. Outside, the storm continued to rage, showing no signs of stopping. He realized they were trapped here together for a while longer. The thought should have made him feel closed in. Instead, it did not. That night, a comfortable quiet settled between them. Margaret read from a worn book of poems while Ethan mended a cracked bridle by the fire. Read one out loud, he said suddenly. Catherine used to read to me. Margaret found a page and began. Her voice was steady and clear, talking about the earth and how life keeps going, even after death. When she finished, the silence in the cabin felt different, fuller. Thank you, Ethan said. She would have liked that. He understands loss, Margaret said, closing the book. I lost my younger brother to a fever when I was 14. Watching my parents taught me that everyone grieves their own way. Some need to talk. Others fall silent. Which one are you? I talk, she said. I figure if we don't speak of the ones we lost, we risk losing them twice. Once to death and again to silence. I've been scared to talk about her, Ethan admitted. Feels like if I start, I won't be able to stop. And what good would I be to Clara then? You're allowed to be a father and a grieving husband at the same time, she said softly. Tell me one thing about her, something that made you smile. He knew right away. She sang off-key something awful, but she sang all the time, making up her own words to hymns when she forgot 'em. Drove me half crazy. His voice cracked. Now I'd give anything to hear it again. What was her favorite thing to make? Apple pie, he said, a real smile finally touching his face. She always said a man who appreciated good pie was a man worth keeping. Margaret's laugh was a soft, warm sound. She sounds wonderful. She was, he said. And saying it out loud, to someone who just listened, helped. It didn't fix the hurt, but it helped. They shared a laugh, nearly bumping into each other in the tight space of the cabin. I will get her, Margaret said kindly. You have been up since well before sunrise. She lifted a fussing Clara and began to sway with her. Besides, I reckon she likes my singing a whole lot more than yours. Ethan found himself smiling as he settled back in his chair. He watched Margaret feed Clara, humming a low and soothing tune. The lamplight cast a warm glow, and the fire crackled, making the little cabin feel like a fortress against the storm raging outside. This, Ethan thought, this is what has been missing. He had forgotten just how lonesome he was, until Margaret arrived. The next morning the weather had only grown meaner. Well, we are not heading anywhere today, either, Margaret announced, already at the stove making coffee. I know you need to get back, and I am sorry. You do not control the weather, he said. Besides, we have work to do here. When was the last time you took a full count of your supplies? Ethan paused. Not since Catherine fell ill. Then that will be our project for today, she declared. We need to know exactly what we are working with, and how to make it all last until spring. He knew she was right. Ethan had been living one day at a time, just using whatever was nearby without a single thought for the long term. He had been so wrapped up in Catherine's sickness and then her passing that he had ignored the basic arithmetic of staying alive. As he watched Margaret move with a quiet purpose, he realized how close he had come to complete disaster. They spent the whole morning taking stock of everything. Margaret wrote it all down in a small notebook, her neat script filling page after page. The final count was not good. Flour was down to 12 pounds, cornmeal to 8. The coffee was nearly gone. They had plenty of salt, but not much else. The cow was giving milk, but the hay to feed her was running low. The chickens had stopped laying eggs in the biting cold. "It is not a good picture," Margaret said at last, looking over her notes. "But we can manage if we are careful." "We," Ethan repeated quietly. She looked up at him. "Just a figure of speech. Of course, once I get back to town, you will be managing on your own." But the way she said it did not sound like someone planning to leave any time soon. And Ethan discovered he had no desire to correct her. As the blizzard howled, Margaret made sure Ethan learned every single step of caring for Clara. She taught him how to warm the milk just right, test the temperature, and keep everything clean. "You cannot be counting on me forever," she said, fixing the angle of the makeshift bottle. "You have to be able to do this on your own to keep Clara healthy and strong." Ethan knew he was learning. Still, there was a world of difference between getting by with help and standing on your own 2 feet. This lesson was not just about surviving the storm. She was getting him ready for all the lonely days that would come after she was gone, teaching him how to be the father his daughter needed. By nightfall, Ethan could manage a full feeding all by himself. It was not as smooth as when Margaret did it, but he was capable. "There now," Margaret said, her voice soft. "Now I can leave without worrying y'all will starve the minute my back is turned." She said it lightly, but her voice caught, as if the thought of leaving was harder than she let on. Ethan took a long look at her. She had been stuck there for nearly 4 whole days, trapped with a grieving man and a newborn, working herself to the bone for people she owed nothing to. She ought to be desperate to get back to her own life, but he could see that she was not. It was in the way she moved around the cabin, the way she had arranged her few things as if she was settling in, not just passing through. She cared about Clara, and maybe even about him. And he had started to care about her, too, in a way that scared him to death. His wife, Catherine, had only been gone 2 weeks. What kind of man would even notice another woman so soon? "Margaret," he started to say, not sure what would come out. But Clara chose that moment to interrupt them. The serious moment was shattered. That night, as he lay awake, he had to face a hard truth. He did not want her to leave. It was not just because she was a help. It was because she had brought a simple comfort back into his life, the feeling of not being completely alone. He genuinely liked her. That feeling felt like a deep betrayal of Catherine and everything they had built together in 3 short years. Guilt washed over him, a heavy and familiar weight. His wife was barely in the ground. This was the worst possible time to feel anything for anybody, and Margaret deserved better than to be a widower's desperate grab for comfort. He would keep his distance, he decided. He would let her teach him, and then, when the snow cleared, he would let her go. On the 6th day, the storm finally broke. Ethan woke to a deep silence with no wind screaming against the walls. Weak sunlight filtered in, making the new world glitter under feet of snow. Margaret was already looking out the window. "It is clearing up," she said. "The road will still be impassable, but by tomorrow or the day after I could make it to town." He stood beside her, looking out at the bright, clean landscape. "If you want to try." She said, "I should?" But her voice was full of doubt. She turned to face him, and in the morning light, he saw the gold flecks in her green eyes. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what are we doing here?" He knew exactly what she was talking about. This connection that had grown between them in 6 trapped days was real. "I do not know," he admitted honestly, "but I know I'm not ready for you to leave yet." She held his gaze, looking vulnerable. "Your wife just died. You are grieving. I am a mess, Margaret. I will not pretend I am not," he said. "But you being here, it is not about filling a space or finding a replacement. You are not Catherine, you are yourself. And I like who that is." "I like who you are too," she said, her voice a whisper. But I am not sure that is enough." Just then, Clara cried out from her cradle, breaking the spell. Margaret moved to tend to her, and Ethan let his words hang in the air. Margaret did not leave the next day, or the day after that. The roads were still treacherous, she reasoned, and the temperature was brutally cold. It would be foolish to try the 12-mile journey to Bentwood. They were practical arguments, and Ethan did not challenge them, even though they both knew the Miller farm was only 5 miles away. The Millers would have surely helped her get to town. Instead, they fell into a routine that felt dangerously like a life together. Ethan handled the heavy outdoor work, chopping wood and clearing paths in the snow. Margaret managed everything inside, cooking, cleaning, and caring for Clara. They worked side by side, their roles falling into place as if they had been doing it for years. In the evenings, after Clara was asleep, they would sit by the fire and talk. Margaret told him about Boston, about growing up in a house full of books and expectations, and a life so predictable it felt suffocating. Ethan told her about learning to ranch from his father, about the hard lessons the land teaches, and the quiet pride of a long day's work. "Do you miss it?" Margaret asked one night. "Boston, I mean." "Sometimes I miss the bookstores," she said with a faraway smile. "But I do not miss the endless social calls and the rigid expectations. My mother wrote me a letter saying I was wasting my potential teaching farmers' children their letters. And what did you write back? That I am contributing in a meaningful way, that those farmers' children deserve the same opportunities as anyone. She has not responded." Ethan looked at her and saw the quiet, stubborn courage that was getting them all through. He smiled to himself. "I imagine that talk did not go the way your mother was hoping. My mother and I rarely see eye to eye on anything that matters." Margaret looked at him, her face softening. "What about you? You have any family that disapproves of your choices?" "My brother seems to think I'm a fool for staying out here after Catherine died. He sent me a letter saying I ought to sell the ranch and take Clara to Colorado. Said he and his wife could help raise her properly." Ethan shook his head. "But this is Clara's home. Catherine is buried right here on this land. I am not about to abandon everything we built just because it got hard." "No, you would not do that," she said with a certainty that warmed his chest. "You are not the abandoning kind." "How can you tell? You have only known me for a short while." "I am a good judge of character. It comes from being a teacher. You learn to read people real quick," she said, studying him. "You are loyal to a fault, Ethan Cole, and you are as stubborn as they come. You do not ask for help, even when you are sinking." She said it gently without any judgment. "Even so, the good in you outweighs the bad by a long shot." He did not know how to respond to that, so he changed the subject and asked about the students she taught. Her entire face lit up when she spoke about them. The quiet little girl who was finally finding her voice in class. The boy who could barely read but was a genius with numbers. "That is what I love about teaching," Margaret said, her eyes shining with a passion he understood. Watching someone figure out they are capable of so much more than they believed. Ethan knew that feeling. It was how he used to feel about ranching before Catherine got sick. That deep satisfaction you get from building something with your own 2 hands. He had lost that feeling in all the grief. But listening to Margaret, seeing her fire, it reminded him that a man could find his purpose again, even after loss tried to take it all away. On the 10th day after Margaret had shown up, Clara smiled for the very first time. It was late in the morning, and Margaret was changing the baby's diaper, talking to her in that gentle, constant voice she always used. "There we are, sweet girl, all clean and dry. Does that not feel better? Let us put you in this pretty gown your mama made for you. You see this stitching? Your mama was so very talented with a needle." And as she spoke, Clara looked straight up into Margaret's face and smiled. It was not gas, but a real, true smile that changed her whole face. Margaret gasped softly. "Ethan, come look." He was by her side in 3 quick steps, leaning over to see. Clara's smile was gone, but as he came into view, she did it again. It was a wobbly, uncertain little smile that was there and gone in a second. Ethan felt his throat tighten up. She smiled, he whispered. Margaret's own smile was radiant. Oh, Clara, you clever girl. That is just wonderful. She scooped the baby up and held her close. Ethan reached out on instinct just to touch his daughter's cheek. His hand brushed against Margaret's shoulder, and for a long moment, neither of them moved away. They just stood there together, sharing a moment that should have been Catherine's. The thought brought a sharp pain of grief, but right behind it came a wave of gratitude that Margaret was here to see it, that he had not been alone. Catherine would have been so proud, Margaret said quietly, almost as if she had read his mind. He just nodded, unable to find his voice. Margaret shifted just a little, turning so they were facing each other with Clara held between them. Her expression changed, and a new vulnerability appeared in her eyes. I ought to go soon. The weather has been clear for a few days now. I cannot keep finding excuses to stay. Are you wanting to go? That ain't the real question here. The question is whether staying is fair to either one of us. She glanced down at little Clara. Ethan, I have been here almost 2 weeks. Folks in town are going to start talking about you, about me, and about me living in a widower's cabin all alone. To heck with your reputation. The words shot out, rougher than he meant them. You saved my daughter's life. Anybody who has a problem with that can answer directly to me. It is not that simple. And you know it, she said. Why not? Why does everything have to be so complicated? He moved closer to see her face. You want the plain truth? I do not want you to go. Not because I need help with Clara, though I surely do. It is because I like having you here. I enjoy our talks. I like the man I am when you are around. If that makes me selfish, well then, I reckon I am selfish. Margaret's breath hitched. Your wife just passed. And I miss her every single day. I will probably miss her for the rest of my life. But she's gone, Margaret. And I'm still here. Clara is still here. And we need... He trailed off, fighting to find the right words. I am not asking you to replace her. I am not even asking you to stay forever. I am just asking you not to leave yet. Don't go because of what folks might say. Only go if you truly want to. They just looked at each other over the baby's head. The only sounds were Clara's soft breathing and the crackling fire. Margaret's eyes were shiny with tears she wouldn't let fall. This is crazy, she whispered. Pure madness. He simply replied, Probably is. People will talk, she said. Let 'em, he answered. My mother will be absolutely horrified. She already thinks you are wasting your life way out here. Well, might as well give her something real to be upset about. Margaret let out a watery little laugh that was half a sob. You are just awful at courting. Has anyone ever told you that? Catherine mentioned it a time or two, he said with a small smile. But she married me anyway. She must have been a very patient woman. Or stubborn, he said, reaching out to touch her cheek with his rough fingertips. Stay, please, at least through the winter. Help me learn how to be a father to Clara. And let us just see. Let us just see what this thing between us is. No promises, no big plans, just time. Margaret closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. When she opened them, her mind was made up. Through the winter, she said. But we are doing this proper. I will stay on as Clara's nursemaid and your housekeeper. We will have separate sleeping quarters and proper behavior. We will do this with respect, or I will never be able to face my students again. Relief washed over him like a warm rain. Whatever you want, he said. And you will tell people that you hired me to help with Clara after Catherine's passing. That makes it respectable. I did hire you, he grinned. Or I would have, if you had given me a chance before you just took over. She gave him a real warm smile this time. See? We are not even lying, just managing the truth a little. Clara chose that moment to let out a loud cry, and they both turned to her, the tension breaking into a familiar routine. But something had changed for good. The air between them hummed with what could be. Margaret was staying. They had time. The next morning, Ethan rode over to the Miller farm to explain things. The Millers were good, practical folks who took his story about hiring Margaret for the winter without much fuss. Mrs. Miller gave him a long, knowing look that said she figured there was more to it, but she just nodded. She promised to spread the word in town that Miss Hale had found proper work and would not be back at the schoolhouse till spring. When Ethan got back home, and it felt like a real home again, Margaret had already rearranged the cabin. She had set up a small sleeping area for herself in a corner hidden behind a curtain she made from a spare blanket. Clara's cradle was moved next to her little spot so she could tend to the baby at night without waking him. It was all set up for propriety, but it was still sensible. The school board might not have me back if they think I have been improper, Margaret explained. This way I can honestly say I had my own separate quarters. You have thought it all through, he said. I always do. Some folks say it is a fault of mine. I would call it a strength, he told her. She smiled. You would? That is one of the things I like about you. You do not see caution and call it fear. In the weeks that followed, they fell into a comfortable rhythm. Ethan handled the ranch work while Margaret managed the house in Clara's care, though Ethan got more and more capable with his little girl. They spent their evenings talking while Clara slept nearby. Slowly and carefully they got to know one another. Ethan learned that Margaret hummed old tunes under her breath while she worked. He learned she had strong opinions on just about everything, and that she remembered nearly everything she ever read. He discovered her dry sense of humor, the kind that caught him off guard and made him laugh out loud. Margaret learned that Ethan's quietness was really thoughtfulness. She saw how he noticed the little things, like when she was tired, and would quietly help without making a fuss. She saw his gift with animals, how he could gentle the wildest horse with just his patience and a soft voice. She learned that he carried his grief quietly but deeply, and sometimes just needed to be left alone with it. They learned to read each other's moods, knowing when to talk and when to just sit together in a comfortable silence. They were learning to navigate They learned to move around that little cabin without bumping into each other, feeling out the quiet rhythm of two people building a life from scratch. All the while, little Clara was growing. She put on weight, her cheeks getting round and her arms getting chubby. She started sleeping through the night, her eyes finally focusing on their faces. One evening, late in February, with 6-week-old Clara asleep, Ethan found Margaret staring out the window into the dusk. "What's on your mind?" he asked. "A letter from my mother," she said. "She's still trying to get me to come home, saying I'm throwing away my future. Am I being fair to you or to Clara? I'm not her mother, Ethan, and you're not looking for a wife. You're a grieving, lonely man just trying to survive. What happens when you don't need me anymore? Do I just go back to teaching and pretend none of this ever happened?" Ethan took a slow breath. "You think that's all this is? Just convenience?" "I don't know what it is," she whispered. "That's the problem." He chose his words with care. "You're right, I'm grieving, and I'm not going to stop anytime soon. And yes, I desperately needed help when you first got here. But Margaret, the reason I asked you to stay, that wasn't about need. It was about want. I wanted you here. I still want you here. Not because it's convenient, but because you make this place feel like it could be a home again someday." "Someday," she repeated softly. "I won't lie and say I'm ready for whatever this is," he admitted. "I'm just asking for time. Time to grieve, right? To learn to be Clara's father, and to see if what I'm feeling for you is real or just desperation with a prettier face." "And what if it is just desperation?" she asked. "Then I'll be man enough to tell you so. But I don't think it is. I think this is real, Margaret. Messy and complicated and probably too soon, but real. And I reckon you feel it too, or you wouldn't still be here." She met his eyes, and after a long moment she nodded. "I do, and it scares me half to death." "Me too," he said. "So we take it one day at a time. When spring comes, if this still feels real, we'll figure out what it means. That is more than most fellas would offer." She finally smiled, a look both sad and full of hope. My mother would say I'm a fool for staying. Well, I say Clara deserves to have people in her life who love her. And you're already halfway there, he replied, squeezing her hand. And I say winter is long and cold, and leaving now would just be bad timing. Come spring, we'll see. She pulled her hand back, but not before agreeing. Until then, we do this right. Nothing that would give folks a reason to judge us. Agreed, Ethan said. And you talk to me when things get hard. Don't you just bottle it up. So they waited. Through the last of February and into March, as winter finally started losing its grip. The days got a little longer and patches of brown grass started appearing where the snow had melted. Ethan went to visit Catherine's grave, bringing dried flowers from the summer before. He sat on the hillside for a good hour telling his late wife all about their daughter and about the good woman who had saved her life. I think you'd like her, he said softly to the wooden cross. She's smart and kind, and she's helping us survive this, Catherine. I hope that's all right. I loved you. I still do. But I think maybe I could love her too, if that's where this road goes. No answer came from the wind, but he walked back to the cabin feeling a little lighter. A week later, on a mild afternoon, Margaret was hanging laundry while Clara slept in a basket nearby. A wagon was coming up the road. Visitors were rare, so she shaded her eyes to get a better look. Two women sat on the wagon seat. One was older, with a face as stern as a rock, and the other was younger, with sharp, disapproving eyes. Margaret's heart sank. She recognized them from town. Mrs. Holbrook, the minister's wife, and Mrs. Patterson, the teacher who took her place. This was not a friendly visit. Ethan came out of the barn and stood beside Margaret, his shoulders set like he was ready for a fight. Mrs. Holbrook climbed down from the wagon. "Miss Hale," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to have a word." "Mrs. Holbrook, Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. "What brings you all the way out here?" "I think you know," Mrs. Holbrook said, her eyes sweeping over the laundry on the line and Margaret's simple work dress. "We've heard some mighty disturbing reports about your situation." "My situation," Margaret replied coolly, "is that I am employed as a housekeeper and a nursemaid. I don't see what's so disturbing about that." "For an unmarried woman to be living alone with a widowed man is highly improper," Mrs. Holbrook declared. "The school board has serious concerns about your moral fitness to be teaching our children." Margaret felt Ethan tense up next to her, but she put a hand on his arm to hold him back. This was her battle to fight. "I am not living alone with Mr. Cole," she stated plainly. "I have my own quarters, and I am caring for a baby who would have died otherwise." "Margaret, no one is questioning your good intentions," Mrs. Patterson said, wringing her hands. "But you have to see how this looks. A young, unmarried woman—" "It's the appearance of sin," Mrs. Holbrook interrupted. "Living with a man to whom you are not married." The words hung in the air like a slap. That was it for Ethan. He stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You will watch your tongue when you speak to Miss Hale. She has done nothing wrong, and I'll thank you to not make accusations you can't prove." Mrs. Holbrook's eyes glittered. "Are you saying there has been nothing improper between you two?" "I'm saying it is none of your business what happens in my home," Ethan said, his voice like cold steel. "But since you're so concerned with the truth, here it is. Miss Hale has been a godsend to my daughter, and to me. She has worked harder than anyone has a right to expect. If you or anyone else wants to twist her kindness into something ugly, you'll have to answer to me. Now, I believe your visit is over." Mrs. Holbrook cut Margaret off before she could even start. "Your excuses just dig the hole deeper. A man and a woman living under the same roof for months, and we are to believe nothing has happened. This whole town is talking, Mr. Cole. Folks have seen you two, shopping and going to church like a married couple." "Because we are raising a child together," Margaret said, her voice tight. "Clara needs a steady life. That is what we give her. If people see wickedness in that, then their minds are smaller than I thought. Your sharp tongue is not helping you, Miss Hale, and your baseless gossip is not helping you, Mrs. Holbrook. Margaret felt that Boston fire her mother always warned her about. You came here with rumors, not facts, and you have smeared our names. I expected better from a preacher's wife. Mrs. Holbrook's face turned beet red. I came to offer you a way out of this mess. I suggest you move back to town before this goes too far and you have to abandon Clara. Abandon them? Where were all these other helpful women when Clara was about to starve? Ethan's voice was sharp enough to cut wire. Where was anyone when my little girl was dying and I did not know how to save her? Miss Hale arrived in a blizzard and saved my child's life. She stayed to make sure Clara stayed healthy. If that cost me your good opinion, then I reckon your good opinion was not worth much to begin with. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, looking pained. Ethan, Margaret, please try to see our side. The school board will not hire her again unless things change. They cannot have a teacher whose reputation is in doubt. My morals are just fine, Margaret said, her voice firm, unless caring for a dying baby is now a sin. You know that is not what I mean, Mrs. Patterson said, looking between them. But if you want to keep teaching, you have to think about how this looks to everyone else. I am done worrying about how things look, Margaret said, and she knew it was true. I came out west to get away from this very kind of judgment. If doing the right thing means small-minded folks disapprove, then that is a price I am willing to pay. Mrs. Holbrook's mouth drew into a thin, hard line. So you are throwing your future away for a man who is not even properly courting you. How foolish. He is courting me, Margaret said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. And not that it is any of your business, but Mr. Cole and I have an understanding. We are just waiting a respectable time after his wife's passing to make it known. Ethan's head snapped toward her, his face a picture of surprise, but he did not say a word against it. Instead, he reached over and took her hand, holding it tight. That is right, he said, his voice steady. I plan on marrying Miss Hale when the time is right. There is nothing improper going on here. Mrs. Patterson's face softened. Well, why did you not say so? An engagement changes everything. Because it is a private matter, Margaret said. We did not think we owed the whole town an explanation. Mrs. Holbrook still looked skeptical. A mighty convenient story to protect your names. Believe whatever you want to believe, Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. But Miss Hale is going to be my wife and Clara's mother. If that is not good enough for you, then I suggest you get off my land before I truly lose my temper. The threat was clear as day. Mrs. Holbrook puffed up, ready for another argument, but Mrs. Patterson put a hand on her arm. We should go. We have said what we came to say. She gave Margaret a look of pity. I surely hope you know what you're doing, dear. They climbed into their wagon and drove off, their disapproving words fading with the dust they kicked up. Margaret and Ethan just stood there watching them go. Then they slowly turned to look at one another. We just told them we are getting engaged, Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, but we are not actually engaged. No, but now the whole town is going to think we are. Probably. Margaret felt a wild laugh bubbling up inside her. This is a complete disaster. Is it? Ethan asked, still holding her hand. It seems to me like we just solved one problem. Ethan, we told them we are getting married. What happens when I leave in the spring like we planned? Do you still want to leave? The question hung in the air between them. A few months ago, the answer was simple. This was temporary. But now, standing here with Ethan's hand in hers and Clara sleeping nearby, the idea of leaving felt like tearing a part of herself away. I do not know, she said softly. I just do not know anymore. Then maybe it is time we figured it out, he said, leading her to a bench near the cabin door. They sat down, their hands still linked. Talk to me, Margaret. What is it you really want? She took a deep breath. I want to keep teaching. I love those children. But I also want... She paused, the words stuck in her throat. I want this. You, Clara. This life we have made. She looked right at him, her defenses finally gone. I came here to prove I could be independent, to get away from my mother's plans for me. And I did it. But somewhere along the way, I got tired of being alone. I wanted to be part of a family. Yes, a family, she said with a shaky laugh, which is likely what my mother wanted all along, just not like this. Not with a rancher in Wyoming, with another woman's child, in a way that would scandalize everyone back home. Would that bother you? Scandalizing respectable people? It should, she admitted, squeezing his hand. I was raised to care about what society thinks. But no, it does not bother me half as much as the thought of leaving you does. Ethan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I loved Catherine. I need you to know that. She was my wife and Clara's mother, and losing her broke something inside me. I know, she whispered. I never asked you to forget her. You need to know something else too, he said, turning to face her. What I feel for you is not second best. You are not a replacement, Margaret. You are something new, something entirely different. What are we then? Real, maybe. He gently tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. I never thought I would want this again, to want someone again. But I do. I want you, not just to help with Clara, but as my partner. As my wife, if you would have me. Margaret could hardly breathe. Are you asking me to marry you? He gave a short, frustrated laugh. I am asking you to think on it, to decide if this life, this place, with me and my daughter, could be enough for you. I cannot promise you an easy life. Ranching is hard and the winters are cruel, but I can promise to love you with everything I have. I will always respect you and support you teaching, and I will never try to change who you are. Catherine will always be a part of our story, but she is not standing between us. She is part of who we were, not who we are becoming. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. I need some time to think. Of course, he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her hand. Take all the time you need. But I meant what I told those women. I am going to marry you, Margaret Hale. Just then, Clara started to cry from her basket. Margaret laughed through her tears as she went to pick her up. Your timing, little one, is just terrible and perfect all at once, she murmured, holding the baby close. Just like everything else around here. Small spaces of the cabin and the much larger spaces of each other's hearts. After a quiet supper that neither of them touched much, Ethan sat Margaret down with a piece of paper. What are you doing? She asked. Making a list, pros and cons. You like things practical, so let's be practical. He drew a line down the middle. Reasons to marry me on this side, reasons not to on that one. Margaret had to smile. This has got to be the least romantic proposal in all of history. I am a rancher, not a poet, he said. Let us start with the cons. Get 'em out in the open. All right, she said, taking the pencil. Con number 1. You are still grieving. This could just be you needing help with Clara. He nodded. Fair enough. Write it down. She did. Con number 2. I would be giving up teaching, or at least making it harder. Married women do not usually teach. That is not always true out here on the frontier, he said. But write it down. Con number 3, I barely know you. Barely know. 3 months is not nearly long enough for a decision this big. Also fair, he agreed. Next. Con number 4, people will always whisper. They will wonder if something improper happened between us. Our children will grow up hearing gossip. Our children, he repeated softly. She realized what she had said. Not just Clara. Our children. She felt her face get warm. Hypothetical children, of course. But he was smiling. Keep going. Con number 5. I will be isolated out here. It is miles to the nearest neighbor. I could be stuck here for months with just you and Clara. Definitely a con, he chuckled. What else? What if it does not work? she whispered. What if we get married and find out we made a terrible mistake? What if this is a terrible mistake? Getting unmarried is not exactly easy out here. Ethan gently took the pencil from her fingers. Those are real concerns, everyone. But let's tally up the good reasons. For one, you love Clara. A blind man could see it. She would have a mother who chose her, who fought for her no matter the cost. Margaret's throat felt tight. I do love her, and we get along well. 3 months in this tiny place and we are not at each other's throats. That has to count for something. He nodded. It does. You also said you were tired of doing everything on your own. A marriage means a partner, someone to help carry the weight. That was true. And, he said, his voice low and steady, I love you, Margaret. I know this is sudden, but it is the God's honest truth. I love the way you think, your strength, your kindness. I want to spend my life showing you that you are loved. She just stared, the words hitting her with real force. You love me. I do. You never said it. I was waiting for the right time. It felt more honest to say it now, when we are being practical instead of getting carried away. He set the pencil down. That is the biggest reason I have got. Everything else is just details. She looked from their list to his steady gaze. I love you too, she whispered. I was not sure if it was real or just the situation, but I am sure now. So is that a yes? He asked. It is a maybe, she said, reaching for his hand. Give me until the spring thaw, when the roads are clear and I could walk away if I wanted to. Ask me again then, and I will give you a certain answer. Fair enough, he kissed her hand. But I already know what you will say. How could you possibly know? Because you look at this cabin like it is home. I hear you singing while you work. You have been planning and planting a garden for weeks. He smiled a little. You are already here in every way that counts. You just need a little time to see it for yourself. She wanted to argue, but when she looked around the room, at Clara's cradle, at her book sitting next to his, at the little corner that had become hers, she knew he was right. This was her home. These were her people. Leaving would break her heart. Spring came on fast over the next 3 weeks. The Millers came by with eggs and town gossip. A couple of Margaret's old students even showed up asking for help with their numbers. And just like that, her cabin was full of life twice a week. It felt good, like the life she had wanted out west. A life of purpose, a life inside a community. But the town's opinion was still a mixed bag. Some folks accepted their story, while others whispered behind their hands. Margaret held her head high, but Ethan took it hard. He nearly got into a fist fight with the shopkeeper over a rude comment. At church, his answer to a nosy question was so sharp the preacher had to step in. You cannot fight the whole town, Margaret told him later. It only makes it worse. They have got no right to judge you. Maybe not. But their words do not change what is real between us. Do not let them get to you. I just want them to see you the way I do, he said, as the woman who saved my daughter and brought the light back into my world. Some will and some will not. We cannot control them, she said with a small smile. We can only control ourselves. Just proves their point. He drew her in, resting his chin on her head. You have more sense than I deserve. She smiled into his shirt. Maybe so, but I'm just lucky I find it charming when you get all protective. He chuckled, and the tightness in the air broke. April blew in warm, with meadowlarks singing on the fence posts. At Catherine's grave, wildflowers had bloomed, making a blanket of purple and yellow. Margaret went there often, talking to Catherine just like Ethan used to. She'd promised to love Clara as her own. She will always know who you were, Margaret said one day. She'll know she had 2 mothers who would have moved mountains for her. 4 months to the day after she first appeared at his door, Ethan led her up a hillside. This is where I want to build our home, he said, looking out over the valley. A real house with room for more children, if you'll have me." He turned to her, his heart in his eyes. "The roads are clear now, Margaret. You could head back east and find everything you came out here for. I know that. But I am asking you to stay and build this life with me." From his pocket he pulled a small box holding a simple gold band. "It belonged to my grandmother. It is the only thing of real value my family ever had, and I want you to have it." Margaret looked from the ring to the sleeping baby on her chest, then to this man who had become her whole world. "Ask me the right way," she whispered. So Ethan dropped to one knee. "Margaret Hale, will you marry me? Will you be a mother to Clara and my wife in all things? I love you more than I can say." She laughed through her tears and pulled him up. "Yes. Oh, yes, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it was made for her. He kissed her right there, with the whole beautiful valley stretching out before them, feeling like home for the very first time. They were married 3 weeks later, on a sunny May morning. The little church in Bentwood was filled with the few folks who believed love was more important than gossip. Margaret wore a simple pale blue dress she had sewn herself. Ethan wore his Sunday suit, his hands clean but still marked by the hard work he did every day. Clara was passed between friends, a sweet reminder of how this family came to be. The preacher kept it short and sweet. When he asked Ethan to take Margaret as his wife, his "I do" was strong and sure. When it was her turn, Margaret looked right at Ethan and said, "I do," with that same steady confidence. The ring was his grandmother's gold band, worn smooth with time but still strong. She had no ring to give him, but he just smiled and said, "You have already given me everything." When the preacher announced the man and wife, Ethan kissed her, a tender and honest kiss that showed everyone how he felt. Mrs. Holbrook made a point of not being there, but Margaret discovered she did not care one bit. The people who mattered had come. After the service, the Millers had a small party at their farm with food and fiddle music. Margaret danced with Ethan, who was still a clumsy dancer, but he was trying his best. She remembered what Catherine had told him. "You are a terrible dancer," she teased. He grinned. "Want me to stop?" "Never," she said, squeezing his hand. Later, as they were getting ready to leave, Mrs. Patterson came over. "I was wrong about you," the woman said softly. "I thought you were just another city girl who would run at the first sign of trouble. You have proven me wrong. The school board has changed its mind. If you want to teach again in the fall, we would be glad to have you back." Margaret's heart felt full. "I would like that very much," she said. The ride back to their cabin was quiet and peaceful. Clara was asleep in Margaret's arms as Ethan drove the wagon. His hand rested on her knee, a gesture that already felt natural. "Are you happy?" he asked as they neared their land. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought I could be again," he admitted. "I keep thinking I should feel guilty for being happy so soon after Catherine, but I just do not. Is that wrong?" "No, it is human," Margaret told him. "Catherine would want you to be happy. She would want her daughter raised in a house full of laughter, not sadness. You are not betraying her memory by living." "How did you get to be so wise?" she teased. "Practice." "And I read a lot of books." He let out a real free laugh. Margaret knew then that this was the life she was meant for, a life built on something real, not just on what society expected. That night, their first as husband and wife, was tender and new. This was a promise, a formal claiming of each other for good. "I want all of it," she whispered to him. "The partnership, the family, the messy, beautiful life we can build together. I chose you, Ethan." Lying there later in the dark, with Ethan's arm around her and Clara sleeping nearby, Margaret felt a sense of peace she had never known. This life was not the one she had planned, but it was so much better. It was richer and more real than any adventure she could have imagined. Spring turned into a warm summer. Ethan worked the ranch with a new fire in his soul. making plans for the future. Margaret took care of Clara, prepared for her return to teaching, and planted a large garden next to the cabin. "This will save us a good deal of money this winter," Ethan said, watching her work the soil with a proud smile on his face. "Where did you learn to grow things?" he asked one evening. "Mostly from books and pure stubbornness." She patted the dirt around a tomato seedling. "My mother wanted me to learn embroidery. I read farming journals instead." "She must have been real proud," he teased. "She thought I was trying to embarrass her, and she was probably right." Margaret looked at her small garden with pride. "But out here, knowing how to grow food is more important than knowing which fork to use." Clara was growing like a weed, changing from a tiny baby into a real little person. She looked a lot like Catherine, his first wife, but she was her own girl, and she was Margaret's daughter in every way that mattered. Margaret was the one who woke for her cries in the night, the one who sang her to sleep. Clara reached for her when she needed comfort. One hot July afternoon, Clara reached up and touched Margaret's cheek, her eyes serious. "Mama," she said, clear as a bell. It was her very first word. Tears started welling up in her eyes. She looked over at Ethan, who was sitting there fixing a bridle, and saw the big smile on his face. "She called me Mama," Margaret whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Well, of course she did. That is who you are." Ethan put the leather down and walked over to them. "Clara is a lucky little girl. She has two mothers, the one who gave her life and the one who chooses her every single day. Both of them matter." Margaret pulled him into a hug, the three of them making a tight family circle. Soon, other good things started to happen. The school board said Margaret could come back to teach 3 days a week, and slowly, the town folk started to change their tune. They saw how little Clara was blooming and how the ranch was doing well. They were just the Coles now, a family building a life. She had a feeling for a few weeks, but she kept it to herself. She told Ethan one evening after Clara was asleep as they sat on the porch watching the sun go down. "I am expecting," she said, plain and simple. Ethan got real still. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor telling me. Yes, I am pregnant." He turned and looked at her, his face a mix of joy and pure fear. "How do you feel about it?" "Scared and excited, both at once," she said, taking his hand. "I know what happened to Catherine, but I want this. I want to give Clara a brother or a sister." His voice cracked when he spoke. "If anything happened to you." "It will not," she said softly. "I am young, and I am healthy. I am not Catherine, Ethan. This is a different woman, and it will be a different outcome." He pulled her in close, his voice muffled in her hair. "I cannot lose you. I just found you. Then we will just have to make sure you do not." Well, news like that travels fast in a small town. Most folks were genuinely happy for them, offering good wishes and advice. One morning, Mrs. Miller showed up with a basket full of baby clothes. "You will want another woman there when your time comes," she said, all business. "Someone who has been through it before. I will come and stay with you for the last few weeks. I can help with Clara and the house." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "You would do that for us?" "Of course, child. That is what neighbors do out here. We help each other through the hard times, and we celebrate the good ones." Mrs. Miller patted her hand. "You have been a blessing for Ethan and that little girl. Helping bring your baby into the world is the least I can do." As autumn came on and her belly started to show, Margaret kept on teaching. She used her own body to teach the children about biology, explaining it all in her plain-spoken way. "Will it hurt?" one little girl asked. "Probably," Margaret said honestly. "But women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Our bodies are made for it." Another student asked, "Weren't you scared to get married and leave teaching?" Margaret just smiled. "I did not leave teaching. I am right here. And yes, I was scared. But being scared does not mean you stop living. It just means you walk carefully, with your eyes wide open." "Do you miss Boston?" someone else asked. "Sometimes I miss the bookstores," she admitted. But here, I get to be who I really am, and that is worth more than all the books in the world. What happens when a second chance at love is haunted by the past? Margaret had walked right into a life torn apart by tragedy, a widower and his baby girl just trying to survive out in the wild country. This story is about how family isn't about replacing what you've lost, but about making room for more. She rested a hand on her belly, dreaming of the home they were building. Ethan's plans were right there on the table, a promise of a real future. One evening, with their 10-month-old daughter Clara on her lap, a peaceful quiet settled over the little cabin. Less than a year ago, Margaret was a school teacher, proud and independent, but awfully lonely. Now, here she was, a wife and a mother, with another baby on the way, smack in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness. She had swapped her solitude for a partnership, and she had never felt more whole. Ethan looked up from his work and saw her smiling. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Just how life turns out in ways you never could have guessed." She looked at him over Clara's little head. "I do wonder what my 23-year-old self would think seeing me married to a rancher and raising babies out here." Ethan knelt beside her chair. "She'd think you'd lost your mind at first. Then she'd meet us and realize you'd finally found it. I love you, Margaret. You gave me my life back." "You gave me a home," she said, touching his cheek. "I reckon we saved each other." Winter passed with a warmth the cabin hadn't known the year before, filled with laughter instead of sorrow. By early March, Mrs. Miller arrived to help, just as she'd promised. The doctor from Bentwood came by and gave a nod of approval. "You're a strong woman," he said. "Just send word when the time comes." Margaret tried not to think about Catherine, about how fast things can go wrong. Her labor began on a gentle afternoon in late March. The pains started out mild, giving them enough time to send for the doctor. Ethan was scared stiff. Margaret could see it in his eyes, in the way his hands trembled. "I'm going to be fine," she told him, her voice steady. "This is different, Ethan. I am not leaving you." "You can't know that for sure," he whispered. "No," she said, gripping his hand as another wave of pain hit. "But I believe it. You have to have a little faith in me." The doctor arrived as the sun went down, and Mrs. Miller took charge with a calm hand. The labor was long, stretching through the whole night. There were moments Margaret felt she might break, but Ethan was right there, holding her hand, his voice a constant comfort. "You're doing so good," he'd say. "So strong. Just a little longer, my love." Then, as the dawn light crept in, she gave one last mighty push. For a terrifying second, there was only silence. Then came a cry, loud and healthy, and just perfect. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, holding up the tiny, squirming baby. Margaret fell back against the pillows, worn out but victorious. Mrs. Miller cleaned the baby and laid him in her arms. He was red and wrinkled, with a crop of dark hair like his daddy's. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Ethan was crying, just looking at his son with pure wonder. "We did it," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're all here. We're all safe." They named him William, after Ethan's father. William Cole, a symbol of a new season and a new start. The next few weeks were a happy, sleepless blur. William was a handful, but Margaret had never felt more complete. Little Clara was taken with her new brother, always wanting to help. As spring bloomed into summer, life found its rhythm. The frame of their new house rose up on the hilltop, a visible sign of their hard work and patience. One June evening, Ethan and Margaret sat on the old cabin's porch, watching Clara play, while William rested in his mother's arms. The sun was setting, painting the whole valley in shades of gold and rose. "This is what I always wanted," Ethan said softly. "What Catherine and I dreamed of. I thought I'd lost it all for good when she passed." "You didn't lose it," Margaret replied. "It just took a different path than you expected. Catherine is still a part of this family. Clara will grow up knowing she was loved by two mothers." "I used to feel guilty," he admitted, "about you loving Clara like your own. Like I was letting Catherine fade away." She's not fading away, Margaret said with a gentle smile. She's being remembered. Love doesn't get divided up when it's shared, Ethan. It multiplies. Clara having two mamas just means she has twice the love in her life. He leaned over and kissed her. We managed it together. As night fell, they gathered their children and went inside. They would finish the new house, grow the ranch, and raise their children to know that family can be built in all sorts of ways. And every year, when that first snow fell, they would remember the blizzard that brought them together and how hope had found them in the middle of a storm. Sometimes help shows up when you least expect it. It can be a knock on the door in the middle of a storm or a stranger who decides to stay. It can be two folks who were hurting, who healed each other by choosing to love instead of being afraid. Years later, Margaret would tell her grandkids the story. She would tell them how their papa was all alone with baby Clara, scared out of his mind, and how a woman showed up in a blizzard with some goat's milk and a whole lot of grit. It was not easy, she would always say, but the best things in life never are. Your papa and I, we found each other when we needed it most, and we built this life one day at a time. And Ethan, sitting right beside her, would take her hand and nod. Every single day, he would say, I choose you every single day. That was their story, a rancher and a school teacher, building a family from loss and hope. When the first big snow of the year fell, the Cole family had a tradition. They would go to the old cabin and stock it full of supplies. They put in food, blankets, and plenty of firewood. Then they would leave a lantern burning in the window. That way, if any traveler got caught in a blizzard, they would find a safe, warm place to ride out the storm. Margaret and Ethan knew what it felt like to be saved by a little kindness in the middle of a storm. So they spent the rest of their lives passing that kindness on. Their legacy was not about money or land. It was about simple human decency, offered to anyone who needed it. It was a light left burning in a window, a promise that nobody had to face the darkness all alone. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.